Hello, and welcome virtually to Books and Books at the studios of Key West. My name is Emily Berg. I'm the store manager here, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce tonight's event with award-winning author Hilma Wolitzer discussing her book, Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket, with our store founder and author, Judy Blume. Just a few housekeeping items before we bring up our authors. Throughout the event, please feel free to use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen to leave questions for our authors. We'll have time at the end of the talk to get to as many of those questions as possible. We'll also, throughout the evening in the chat function, have links to purchase the book. And you will also get a link to both a recording of the event and to purchase the book after. So if you don't get it, don't worry, you'll have plenty of opportunity. If at any time you're having any technical trouble, please email us at booksandbooks@tskw.org. We'll be monitoring that email throughout the event and we'll try to help as much as possible. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight's event. She is a wonderful author, a lovely lady, and the co-founder of this store, Judy Blume.
Hello, everyone. Hi, thank you for being here. Thank you, Emily, so much. Now, George, did something go wrong there or what? Talking to my techie guy here. Emily, are we okay? What's happening?
We're good. That's just me. That's my face now until I come back on.
You're okay.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Whatever. It just, I'm not there on the screen and Hilma's in a little, okay. No problem. Wait, George, don't mess it up. Don't mess it up. Oh God, I hate these things. Hi, Hilma.
Hi, Judy.
And I'm gonna introduce you in my little way. This is such a treat for me, and I miss you so much, Hilma.
I miss you too. I miss you and I miss George very much.
Well, Hilma and George and I, we are, I promise I wouldn't say old friends because we are old, but we are old, long time, very close friends. We were just trying to figure it out, and I know that my son Larry was in traction on the day that we met, and he probably in 3rd or 4th grade. I won't even say how old he is now, but he's way beyond that, like maybe 50 years beyond that. So we go back a long time. And I always like to say, Hilma, that ending was our beginning. And I have to explain that because ending is the title of your first novel. And it's still right here. That book is right here. I can tell you little bits and scenes that I remember so well from that book. But the new book is just incredible. I mean, Elizabeth Strout says it beautifully in the beginning of her introduction. Hilma Wolitzer once told an interviewer, "I don't believe there's such a thing as ordinary life. I think all life is extraordinary." And you are
that way, yes.
And you are extraordinary. And this book is extraordinary. And I can't thank you enough for it. I just reread it again this afternoon and you said, "Oh, poor you." But no, lucky me that I know the person who wrote this book. So Hilma, tell the story of how we met.
How we didn't meet.
Well, all right.
Well, actually, I saw you, and very briefly, Judy came to speak at our public library on Long Island, and I was very excited because I had never met another writer before, and I felt that I would meet Judy and then invite her for lunch along with whoever was accompanying her. And I made this marvelous shrimp salad, and Judy could not go to lunch for whatever reason. You can say why. Did you tell the truth, Judy?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, the truth. No, the truth, I couldn't go to lunch was because I had this little boy at home in traction.
oh, okay. But
I also remember, I just have to tell you, Hilma, I remember that was like one of my worst library. It was early in my career too. It was one of my worst moments. I was terrible. I was just awful.
I don't
got
remember
lost.
that. See,
Well, I do. You know, we remember those things.
I thought you were wonderful, and I couldn't wait to have you back at my house for shrimp salad. And you declined, and I found out later that you're severely allergic to seafood. So I probably
Shrimp, yes, shellfish.
writer I met.
Shellfish, right. But
Yeah.
you didn't know that. I didn't know it was going to be shrimp. Nobody told me that. So had I been able to go, you would have given me peanut butter and everything would have been fine. And
I guess.
we'd still be close friends.
50 years.
50 years, yes, yes. So Hilma, how did this book come about?
Well, it's a very odd story. I had no intention of collecting these short stories. Most of them were even older than our friendship. I mean, some of them, one of them I believe is 55 years old. And they weren't on my mind. It was at the beginning of the pandemic, and my husband contracted it. Morty, you know him, you knew him well. He contracted COVID, was hospitalized. A few days later, I came down with it and was hospitalized in a different hospital. He was much sicker than I was, and he died of it 2 days before I was released from the hospital. But while this was all going on, my daughter Meg, the writer, was rereading the stories, and she came up with the idea of collecting them. And when she approached me about it, I really wasn't interested. I was grieving, I felt very ill, and I just wasn't in the mood. And she even petitioned my agent about it and got him interested in it. And the more she talked about it, I was now home alone. None of us could go through the regular morning rituals at all. We couldn't see one another. Nobody was with my husband while he was dying. Nobody saw him off. It was just very hard. But then I began to think that I needed something to do beside grieve. And I needed something to look forward to, which I think everyone needs. Even at 91, you need something to look forward to. And since I'm generally an optimistic person, I do look forward to things. And this book became my reason for being, my raison d'etre. It was just something that I could do, be involved with, distract me from everything that was happening, which was pretty awful for everyone. I felt isolated, of course, but I didn't feel alone because the world community was involved in this. Other people had lost loved ones as well. So I felt part of a large community. And when I began working on the stories, I realized that I had to write one new story to go with the old ones. And it was going to be more autobiographical than anything I'd ever written. I sort of think of fiction as truth wrapped in a lie, or maybe it's a lie wrapped in the truth, I'm not sure, but I never used our personal experience directly. I protected our privacy and my family's privacy. I would use a great line if someone said something wonderful. And my mother was such a great Mrs. Malaprop that I had to use her lines, but she's not a character in it, not really. But when I wrote the final story, The Great Escape, I was writing about the experience of having a long marriage ended by the COVID pandemic. And so many of the details are real. Others are fabricated. And it was hard to write. It was painful, and it was also cathartic at the same time, which was very odd.
And it's a fabulous story. And it's still, no matter what the subject, Hilma, you always find the humor.
Well, that's actually true. I guess I have a sense of the absurd, that in the darkest moments, something funny always seems to happen, or at least it strikes me as being funny. I mean, even if other people are laughing, I start laughing. It's so contagious.
And the stories,
that word actually.
And the stories make us laugh, and they bring us together. And you know, I mean, it doesn't matter. I know that the stories are, I've read this and I've heard this, but I don't pay any attention to this. The stories are of their time and place. And yet the stories are so universal, and they could be happening today as well as whenever you set them and wrote them, because they're about character. They're about character, and that's what's important to you, I think.
Yes, and it's the inner lives of the characters. So if there are no cell phones and there are no computers in the stories because they were written 50 years ago, the women in particular, whose first person is often voiced, are expressing a certain restlessness that I think goes down through the centuries of women's feelings about their lives. Now, I love my domestic life. I love being a wife and a mother, and I love making all those Jell-O molds and those Halloween costumes and all that stuff. But at the same time, I felt I needed to do something else. And when I discovered what it was, I had all this material from the domestic life to use. And I wasn't sure it was valid material, but it turned out that it was.
Of course it is, Hilma. You know, we have so much in common, so much in common. You are a much better writer. Don't say anything.
So
I do what I can do. You do what you do. But anyway, but what's in common is, you know, I had the domestic life too. The little children, the husband, living in the suburbs, never knowing another writer. But something was missing for me. That creative outlet that I desperately needed. I was happy with my children, my life, but I needed something else. And
exactly.
it turned out to be writing. So interesting.
So we were having this parallel experience, and we had never even met, and I hadn't even poisoned you with my shellfish yet.
That is true. I think I had probably at that time just found out that I was allergic to shrimp. So it's good that I didn't eat it. But what I've always thought, and I think you do too, is that these stories that connect us from generation to generation. I mean, when you wrote these stories, it was about our generation, but then our daughters' generation, the same stories, the same lives. And then now the next generation is discovering you, and how lucky for them that they can discover you now.
Well, it's amazing to me that I've heard from younger readers. When I say, well, everybody's younger than I am now, but that relatively young women who really relate to the stories, who weren't even born when the stories were written, and yet they found themselves in it. They had that shock of recognition, which is so pleasing to me, so thrilling.
Yeah, it's so great. I mean, there's a story called Sunday. Is it called Sundays? Sundays. Oh God, I love that story. Well, let's just talk a little bit about Polly and Howard. Polly and Howard are a couple who many of the stories are about. Polly is telling the story.
They start out as young people falling in love, becoming pregnant, and getting married in that order. And then they are home with their children. They have 2 children. Their children start to grow up. And in the final story, they're almost 90. They're a little younger than I am, actually. But I brought them into old age and the age of COVID. And
so it could be a novel. I mean, the way the stories about Polly and Howard read.
Yeah, except that other stories were coming to me in between. Yeah. I was writing stories that weren't related to them.
But that's okay. That's great.
Yes,
they're in there too. They're so funny. They're so funny and real. And I mean, you just feel that you know these people.
Well, I felt as if I knew them. I felt as if they were living inside my head for years. And they were like friends who had moved out of the neighborhood. And I always wondered what happened to them. And the only way you can find out what happened to them is to write about them. And this is my great curiosity about everything in life. What happens next? When I wake up every morning, I want to know what happened while I was sleeping. I mean, I need to just find out. It's a curiosity about, and it's a curiosity about other people and their lives. When I used to sit on the subway, when I was a working girl and used to go in the rush hour, there would be people sitting opposite me, and I felt they all had interesting lives that I didn't know about. And sometimes I imagined them because it was something to do during that long, tedious ride. And then later on, I had a friend who was a psychiatrist. And I said, I think that everybody has an interesting inner life. And she said, no, they don't.
No.
Yes,
Really?
that's what she will go unnamed, but it's true. She said a lot of people are just plain boring. And I just never found anybody completely boring or completely a villain or completely a hero. I felt they had a lot of different human dimension, and that as a writer, you have to try to discover all the dimensions of a character and present them in full human regalia.
As a writer, you get to strike the boring and bring up the more interesting parts. So maybe your friend only heard the boring parts of somebody's life, but you got to imagine the parts that weren't. Anyway, there's nothing boring about the characters in your stories. They're not boring. Tell me about writing, Hilma. Did you always want to write?
Well, as a child, I did not grow up in a literary household. The only books were an ancient set of encyclopedia, which I read, and Dr. Morris Fishbine's Home Medical Advisor. So I sort of became a hypochondriac before I became a writer. And my parents, I don't know what their reaction would have been had I not had a particular experience. I began writing poems. They were really bad, terrible poems as a small child. And my mother went to have a parent-teacher conference. I believe it was my 4th grade teacher, Miss Fredericks. And my mother came home glowing and reported to my father that Miss Fredericks said, Hilma shows great promise. And at that point, I think they began to pay attention to my poems. And they played cards a few times a week, and they allowed me or invited me to read my poems aloud to these card players who couldn't have cared less about it. All they wanted to do was get to the next hand. But they listened politely and even applauded. And I went to bed with that applause ringing in my ears. I had gotten all this wonderful attention. And I think that was the beginning for me. There was respect for it. But later on, when I began to write as a young mother, on the way to becoming a middle-aged mother, I don't think anybody thought of it as more than a nice hobby that I had. And I think publication changed all that. It was like, oh, I have to tell the end of the story about Miss Fredericks. I almost forgot. Fast forward about 50 years again, and I'm giving a reading in a library in New Jersey. And after the reading, a very tiny, very old woman comes up to me and says, Hilma, you don't recognize me. I'm Miss Fredericks. I was your 4th grade teacher. And I was in shock and I gushed completely. And I said to her, Miss Fredericks, I think you changed my life. You gave me such early encouragement. You told my mother that I showed great promise. And she said, oh, honey, I told that to all the mothers. Put me in my place.
But that's a sweet story.
That was really the beginning. And
I read that you won a contest once with one of your poems when you were about 9 years old.
Well, what it was, there was an after-school program sponsored by the Department of Sanitation, which I joined, and they had something called the Junior Inspectors Club. and they put out a mimeographed publication called The Junior Inspector. And I can't say I won a prize, but I got publication, a poem called Winter. And the prize was that my mother and I got to go down to the Department of Sanitation, where a man behind a desk stood up and shook my hand and gave me a certificate. And then afterwards, my mother and I walked down the street, which was lined with garbage trucks, which might have been crossed swords at West Point. It was so wonderful. It was so official and military and just wonderful. And at that point, I realized that there's something to this being a writer. And of course, you find out that not all attention is positive, that you can get bad reviews, you can get rejected, and you just have to take it all in and accept it.
You have to keep going. But so all this time, all the years that you were a young married with little children, that you weren't writing that we knew of, were you still doing stories inside your head, but you didn't write them down?
When we were first married, I was 22. Morty was in the Marines, and he was stationed down south, and I was there with him, and I wrote a short story. And I sent it to the only magazine I could think of, which was the New Yorker. And I got a rejection slip that was handwritten and said, "Try us again," which was more success than I could handle, because I didn't write another story until I was in my mid-30s. And then I wrote a story, and something miraculous happened again. It was sort of like another Miss Frederick story. I didn't know whether it was really a story or not. I showed it to Morty, and he said, "Why don't you show it?" And he mentioned this friend of ours who was an artist and an art critic, because he was so intelligent and so well read. And we gave the story to him. And that night, he put the story in his pocket. And that night, he went to a party where he met a literary agent who happened to be John Steinbeck's agent at the time. She read the story, called me the next day and said, "I'd like to represent you." And I felt, well, I have an agent, I must become a writer. I immediately went into the bathroom and tried on scarves to see if I looked more like a writer now that I had an agent. And she sold that first story, which is the title story of the book, "Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket." She sold it to the Saturday Evening Post. And at that point, we were living in the suburbs. We had a very modest income. We had one old car, which Morty took to work, and he was working a couple of jobs. So I was home in the suburbs without a car with the kids. And when he came home, I did my grocery shopping at night with the car, or walked the kids to a grocery store, walked about a half a mile or so. And this was amazing. And a friend of Morty said, "Gee, I had gone right across the street and bought a car that afternoon. I put a down payment on a Rambler station wagon." And a friend of Morty said, "Gee, maybe she'll have a fleet of Ramblers before long." But it didn't work out that way. This wonderful agent, and she was wonderful, didn't sell another story for 3 years. And then it was to a small literary magazine for just about enough money to put gas in the car. And I realized that I wasn't in it for the money, which was just as well, or the attention.
And then Ending came after that. Did you decide to write a novel, or did this novel just come to you?
Well, actually, the literary magazine was called New American Review, and the editor was a man named Ted Solitaroff. And when he took one of the stories, the second published story, he sent me a note asking if I've written a novel. He'd love to look at it. And I said, "Gee, now I have to write a novel." And I did. And he liked it. And he was working for a publishing house that didn't publish hardcover books. So he took the paperback rights to it and sold the hardback rights to somebody else. I mean, I've just been very lucky in many ways.
Well, Hilma, you know.
Yes, but as a late.
You're lucky. Yes, you've been lucky, but you're really, really, really good. And we need to say that. We need to be
talking.
Okay. So we're good together, okay, and
Okay.
we're friends together. But so let's. You said that you would read a little bit from the last story in the book, the newest
I will read very little, and
story,
it'll just be the very beginning of the story.
just the very beginning, and then we'll go back to some of the others.
Now, these are the same characters, Paulette and Howard, who we see in the earlier stories fall in love, have a baby, get married. And now suddenly it's much later. The Great Escape. I used to look at Howard first thing in the morning to see if he was awake too, and if he wanted to get something going before one of the kids crashed into the room and plopped down between us like an Amish bundling board. Lately, though, with the children long grown and gone to their own marriage beds, I found myself glancing over to see if Howard was still alive, holding my breath while I watched for the shallow rise and fall of his, the way I had once watched for a promising rise in the bedclothes. Whenever I saw that he was breathing and that the weather waited just behind the blinds to be let in, I felt an irrational surge of happiness. Another day, and then another, and another, and another. Breakfast, vitamins, bills, argument, blood pressure pills, lunch, doctor, cholesterol medicine, the telephone, supper, TV, sleeping pills, sleep, waking. It seemed as if it would all go on forever in that exquisitely boring and beautiful way. But of course it wouldn't. Everyone knows that.
The beginning of a wonderful story. Yeah.
I wrote it so quickly, and I hadn't written any fiction for a very long time. I've been writing grown-up poems, and I didn't think I could write fiction anymore. And when I began to write this, it was just the way I always wrote. So quickly, I didn't think I could type that fast. And I forgot who I was, how old I was, until I passed a mirror on my way to the bathroom or the kitchen, and then I would remember. But you get lost, as you know, in the fictional universe.
Well, that's when you know it's working, isn't it? When
Yeah.
that it's when you know, when you get up and 3 or 4 hours have gone, and it's like, where did they go? And how did I do this?
You
Because
start in the morning and suddenly it's dark out.
well, I don't know that I ever got that far. I just started in the morning and suddenly it was lunchtime. And
Well.
that was a long time.
Yeah, my kids even came home for lunch from school. So I had very few hours. And Morty, as you know, was a psychologist, and we were a 2-typewriter family. We had 2 standard typewriters. We sat at either end of the kitchen table. He was typing up his patient reports, and I was typing up my stories, and the children were running around and the dog was barking, and it was fine because I was just lost in that fictional universe. Later on, I became more neurotic about it. And I suddenly said, I need peace, I need quiet, I don't need all these distractions. And when Nancy, our older daughter, went off to college, for a little while, I kept her room as a shrine to her. But then I realized when she's not here, I can use it to write. And Morty found an old door and bolted it to the wall, and it became a desk. And my standard typewriter went on there. And that was the beginning of a different kind of life for me as a writer. It was the isolation, remember what you asked for. I asked for solitude, I asked for silence, and now I have it. And I'm on the 18th floor of a high-rise in Manhattan. And it's, except for some ambulances and fire engines that go by and some construction in the apartment next door, it's very, very quiet here. But then there's all that domestic chaos is still in my head. And the characters come in and they tell me their story.
And you share it with us, which is great, as it should be, Hilma.
Yeah, well, I write it, and then, well, this time I was writing it, hoping it would be added to the book and be published. But when you first write, you're writing for yourself, aren't you, Judy? Don't you?
Totally. Yeah.
You don't think of an audience.
No, never. No.
You hope that you hope someone besides your mother and your agent will read it, you know, but
Yes.
think of that while you're working.
I think if you think of an audience while you're working, that's big trouble. And I would advise anyone who asked me never to think of your audience, you know. I mean, if you're writing for young people, maybe you have an idea. I mean, if it's a picture book, it's for a certain age. You've written children's books, so you know this. But other than that, never think of your audience.
You don't, and I'm
And
sure
you don't.
you've got millions of letters from children, and children write the best letters. I've gotten them from one kid wrote and said, "I loved your book. The first page was the best part." And this wonderful 12-year-old boy, I found his letter. It fell out of a book the other day, and I even posted it on my Facebook page because it was the most amazing letter. He said he'd read one of the books and that it filled him with feelings of sadness, gladness, and well-being.
Well, that's a kid who should write blurbs.
You're not kidding.
Right.
And then his PS was the most wonderful PS because he had written, "Dear Ms. Wolitzer," and he wrote, "PS, I didn't know whether you were married, so I hope you don't mind."
Ah,
It was so endearing.
yes.
I hid his last name when I put the letter up because now he's probably a middle-aged man who might be embarrassed by having written that letter to a writer so many years ago.
That's so great. Do you hear from your adult readers? And
Yes,
you
yes,
do?
yes, I do. Do you hear from your adult readers as well?
Yes. I mean, it depends. If I'm every time I write a book, yes.
Well, you hear from adults who read your children's books and who read your adult books. I'm very surprised. I don't just hear from women, which is what I'd sort of expect because the stories, though they include men and are sympathetic to men, are mainly in the female characters' sensibility. I do hear from men and they like it, though my previous book, a novel called An Available Man, is from the point of view of a man. And it was fun to do that. And it was because that's the ultimate other when you're considering the other. I did write a children's book years ago about a 13-year-old boy. The other children's novels were about girls. And I wrote this and I sent it to my editor. And he's after a first draft, and he said, "I really like this a lot, except there's one problem. This 13-year-old boy sounds like a 50-year-old woman." So voice became an important thing. And what I did was I visited a couple of schools and listened to kids talk. And I began to hear the rhythm of their language. I mean, if a kid's running away from home, he will not say, "On the eve of my departure," which is one of the sentences I had to change. The night
Did you
before
publish? Is that a book that you published? Did you publish that book?
Yes, I did. It's called Wish You Were Here.
Oh, I remember Wish You Were Here. Yes,
That
yes.
was a very long time ago.
I know how long ago. Right, right, right. I'm just looking, Hilma. I had so many great notes. Hilma and I had a little preview conversation the other day, and mostly I laughed through the whole thing because Hilma is very, very funny in her writing and in real life. Oh, I did want to ask you, talking about very funny, about having people always say, what is it like having, you know, your mother is a famous writer? And I can turn that around and say, what is it like having a famous writer who is your daughter?
Oh, it's absolutely terrific because not only is she a wonderful writer, she's a wonderful daughter.
This is Meg Wolitzer.
And she's a wonderful mother as well, which is an amazing thing when you raise a daughter who becomes a mother and is so great at it, better than you ever were. And she's also this terrific writer. And when your child chooses to do something you do, it's a great compliment. It really is. And my older daughter, Nancy, I started out as a visual artist. I did portraits. And Nancy is a much more inventive artist than I ever was. But both of my children are doing something I did earlier in my life. And that's very pleasing to me. And I admire them very much. And Meg and I, because of the writing, this adds another dimension to our relationship because we share work. We send each other first drafts. When she was a child, she began writing very young. I was this late bloomer. I published my first novel, I was 44. Meg was 22 when she published her first novel. And the family joke was that my mother had until she was 88, but she missed her deadline. But when she was 11, again, we're having it, she published her first short story. It was in a children's magazine. And when she would show me this very early work, I was just struck with how wonderful she was and how brilliant. And I said all these positive things about it, and very annoyed, she turned to me and she said, "You just love everything I do." And I realized that she wanted to be treated like a writer with respect, and that I had to criticize her. If I did it a little bit too much, she would cry, of course, but I had to find that happy medium, which helped me as a teacher when I began teaching writing, that balance between honesty and charity. Honesty because you want to say something that will help the writer make the story better, and charity because you have to be aware of the beating heart behind that story, that there's a person there. And in workshops, people can be very cruel. My first experience in a workshop, when I was in my mid-30s, I took my first writing class right before I published a story at the New School with Anatole Bourriard. And it was a beginner workshop. And when I went into the room, it was mobbed with people. He had read all their stories. Everybody had to submit a story to get in. And he called on me first to come to the front of the room and read my story aloud. First of all, I was very embarrassed because he said, "Spit out your gum first." And I spit it into my purse because I had no place else to put it. And I went to the front of the room and I read the story hyperventilating without any affect at all. And then I sank into my seat, collapsed really. And Anatole said, "Well, who would like to comment?" And this man raised his hand and said, "That was the most boring thing I've ever heard."
Oh,
That was the first comment I had heard about my work. And I was ready to pack it in. I was ready to just go home and make Jell-O forever. But Anatole sent me a note, which I still have, which says, "The story is fine, see me later." And what he did was put me into an advanced workshop and had me read the story there. And they didn't like it either. But they gave me constructive criticism. And that really taught me about revision and again, about teaching.
I think something that I've witnessed a little bit myself, because you gave some workshops that happened in my side yard in Key West when we were
But you
living,
generously gave me your,
which was very
your
nice.
art.
And that was great fun because I was supposed to be working, on my computer, but I could hear what was going on and it just sounded so great. And I think you told me, Hilma, something that is very important to me, not that I teach, but what I tell people, to be generous in your criticism.
Well, to find something positive to say that will ameliorate the harsh criticism a little bit. You don't lie, you're going to be honest, but if you can point out a really good sentence that the writer might not even recognize is his or her strength, they will focus on that as well.
I thought you told me you set the rules. Maybe you didn't tell me this, that no cruelty.
No,
We
no
don't do cruelty in this workshop.
criticism without cruelty. And I visited a school in the South once, and these were sixth graders. They were gifted children, and they were writing journals, and the teacher had them get up and read. And the rule was, after the person read, you had to say something positive. And they were so adorable, these children. This young girl got up and read from her journal, and another girl raised her hand and said, "I love your blouse." And it was just absolutely marvelous. And I
But
didn't
I
have
think
that in my workshop.
But people who've taken your workshop, and we have to go to our questions, I know, people who have taken your workshop are always struck by, if you feel safe, you can do so much more than if you're worried about the next person who's going to get up and just say something horrible. So you provide that safe workshop.
I guess because of the trauma of my own experience in a
Maybe so.
workshop,
Maybe
I
that's
think
good.
I realized how that feels. But you can't really lie. I mean, sometimes a story isn't salvageable, but there might be one line that you can use later in another story, or one character who appeals to you. And I remember another thing, the negative thing this child said in the class after saying how much she liked her friend's blouse. The negative thing was, "I wish there was more about that grandmother. I loved her."
Well, that's great. What great kids to be able to
Yeah, they were
say. I mean, you as a teacher saying, I wish there was more of that grandmother in your story because I really loved her. That's great.
And when I came home, the children were all told they had a right to me. Now, I'd gotten letters from children that said, "Dear Miss Wolitzer, it's author week and I got you." And I felt the subtext was, I really wish I'd gotten Judy Blume, but I got you. And when I got home, this entire gifted class made cards for me. And one of them said, "Dear Mrs. Wolitzer, thank you so much for coming to our class. You really inspired us." How can you not find humor in things?
Now you're making me cough because I'm laughing. But I just want to make sure that everyone does understand that Hilma's writing is so real. It's so real. And it's got and the humor in it just, I mean, every book, I waited for every book, and then I would just go and hide to read each novel that Hilma has written. And so I think if you don't know her work, you're in for a treat. And if you know her work, you're in for another treat. So let's go to Emily, Hilma, okay? And some questions. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Emily.
Hi. I just had to get myself unmuted there. Well, first of all, I've been laughing hysterically through this whole thing, so you guys don't know that. But
Oh, good.
And also, I wanted to share that the chat has just been so lovely, and everybody's been sharing, regret for your loss, Hilma, and thanks for sharing, and being willing to write and let us in on those things. So I did want to let you know that we do have some really great questions. Since you guys are talking about humor, Alex wrote, and maybe you kind of covered this a little bit. Actors always say comedy is harder than drama. You're so funny, and I know it comes naturally to you as a person, but how do you write funny without trying too hard, or get lost in the joke, or fall in love with a good line at the expense of the story?
Wow, that's a hard question. It's a good question, but it's a hard one to answer because the humor and the drama seem to come naturally out of the story that you want to tell and out of the character's sensibility. If I know the characters, I have to know the characters. I never plot out a story. I really try to understand who the characters are. And my characters usually have a sense of humor. And so I borrow from them in that way. I'm not sure how it comes. Judy, do you know?
I have no idea how it comes, but I would say the same way, but I know it's not a joke. The question was something about the joke. It's never a joke. It's always, maybe it's in the dialogue, maybe it's something, and it isn't something that you say, I have to get something funny here. It happens spontaneously. I know, Hilma, you agree, because it all comes from the characters. Yeah.
Yep, I hold them responsible.
We also have a question from Julie, and I wondered this myself. How do you decide because you did say that it's all fictional, but that there is, moments here and there that are from real life. How do you decide what things that happen in real life are okay to go into a story? And are there things you decide not to write about because someone might be offended?
I do care about people's feelings. I feel that people are more important than fiction. And I would never write something that I felt would expose someone or make them feel embarrassed or hurt in any way. And even though the mother and father in my stories, I find them very funny, as I found my own parents very funny, I don't think they're as lovable as my parents. So they're not my parents. And Howard isn't my husband, except in that final story, in the final moments of that final story. So many of the facts are true, but even there, I changed things. The doctor who cared for Morty in his last days called me every night in my hospital to tell me how he was doing, which was not well, but he was holding out hope all the time. And then later on, he told my children, who were also in touch with him, he was a very kind doctor, that if I wanted to talk to him, I had his number and I could call him. And for a long time, I couldn't because it was too painful. I didn't want to, as I said in the story, I didn't want to hear about last words. I didn't want to hear about last breaths. But then finally, I called him and I said, as I say in the story, I had to call you because I was afraid you would forget about us. I mean, there were so many deaths, the times were dense with obituaries. And this doctor actually said, forget about you. And he was a young, probably a resident. He said, I will carry your husband in my heart all my life. Well, I didn't put that in the story. It moved me tremendously, but it also sounded corny when I repeated it. And instead he says something else, which I now can't remember, but he says something else that makes her feel good about having spoken to him, as I felt very good after speaking to this doctor. I thought that was such a touching thing to say, and how kind of him. The kindness of strangers throughout this entire ordeal has been just terrific. And the support of my own family, my children and my grandchildren and my children's spouses have just been remarkable, especially since we couldn't really be together. We couldn't see each other. We would stand in the street and wave at each other with masks on. It was so odd.
What would you tell people about getting vaccinated, Hilma?
Oh, finally, after having COVID, I was advised that I needed to get vaccinated. And that became a hard thing to arrange. You just couldn't. You'd go online and you'd find out there was something, I live in Manhattan, and there was something in the Bronx or someplace else. And how was I going to get there? I'm 91, will I have to wait for a long time for it? Will I be exposed to COVID while I'm there? Will there be other people there? It was a worrisome thing, but I've now been triple vaccinated because I have some immune problems, and I'm very glad I did. And I wish all people would get vaccinated so that we can get over this pandemic and start putting our arms around each other again. It would be wonderful.
It would be.
I think, yeah, I just want to interrupt for a second and say my own, because even though we talked a little bit about this when we met earlier, how the stories really are timeless. And I was one of those younger readers that was
Thank you.
surprised, yeah, how much I related to these women. And it really made me think of like my grandmother and my mother and all these people that I always thought I probably have nothing in common with, but I really do. But the last story, it, even though it's timeless, but it's so obviously COVID. And even though it was only a year and a half ago that it would have taken place, those early days of COVID, I had already forgotten about. And the, like, I really related to the daughter calling and saying, and they're saying, no, she's being so dramatic. And that's what I went through with my mom as well. She's like, I'm fine, because we just didn't know. So it was an interesting thing that I think it's still timeless, even though it's so obviously 2020. I think in 50 years, that story will be the perfect, like, this is what COVID was like, especially in the, first few months.
Yeah, it was very strange in the early months. I don't think my husband took it as seriously as I did. I mean, I was washing the New York Times and then hanging it up in the bathroom to dry. It's the print running all over it. I was insane. And he was disabled, so he had to do particular exercises every day to keep himself going. And there was a gym in the building. And he insisted on going the day before they closed the gym. And that was in mid-March. And he went into the hospital on the 29th of March and died on April 11th. So the time frame is right there. And to me, it's indelible. I mean, to me, it could have happened yesterday. I realize that as time goes on, you do forget. And that's a saving grace we have, to forget something really bad and give ourselves the relief of a better day.
Hilma and Emily, I just want to remind everybody what a great, great book this is for book clubs. And wonderful Meg just sent a little note that reminded me that I hadn't talked about that yet. What a wonderful book for book clubs, because there are these different stories and you can talk about the characters from each story, because we get to know them so well. We get to know, in a few pages, we really get to know and care about these people and laugh.
You can be young like Emily, not old.
They can be young like Emily. Yes, they can be young like Emily, or even younger than Emily.
Even younger than me, yeah.
There's nobody younger than you, Emily.
So we've got, if you're okay with it, we've got a couple of other really great questions I'd love to get to. One, and I thought this was great. This is from Susan Isaacs. And she said, did you ever have the desire to expand a short story, either the last one or any of them, into a novel? Or are short stories a different type of animal? What moves you to write one or another?
I used to think that the short story was a writer's apprenticeship, her adolescence, and the novel was her maturity. I no longer feel that way, especially after reading Chekhov and Alice Munro and Grace Paley, all wonderful short story writers. And I also used to think that a novel was just longer than a story, but it's not, it's wider, it's more inclusive. But this doesn't mean that the passage of time has to reflect the length of the manuscript. I mean, you have Mrs. Dalloway, a novel that takes place in one day, and you have some of Alice Munro's marvelous stories that go through generations in a short story. So, but I just find it's more inclusive. If you're writing a novel, you might want to know more about peripheral characters. They start to interest you. And you realize you're not driving toward a revelation or an epiphany. You're writing a life, if that makes any sense.
Hilma, is it any chance that maybe Polly and Howard will move into a novel of their own?
No, I'm going to write another story about her, though, because this has occurred to me. What happens to her now that she's 90 and by herself, and her relationship with her children as it is? What happens to people who have been independent all their lives and now are suddenly terrified of losing this independence, as I think everybody who grows older and is still in her right mind has to worry about, or even not in her right mind. Maybe that would even be worse. I don't know. But I'm very interested in doing that.
That would be great. Emily, do you have another question?
Yeah, just a couple more, if it's all right. Let's see. Sorry, I was listening and I lost track.
That's good.
On you.
I'm too invested in the conversation. Michelle Potts wrote, how do you know when a story is finished, especially a short story?
It just stops. I can't explain it in any other way, except that sometimes I might go on too long and realize it ended a page ago. And I can even move the material around so that the very ending goes in the middle and the middle becomes the ending. I can't even explain it in any other way. It's subject to change. I mean, everything. I mean, Meg and I often talk about the fact that we would go, Meg, she says during readings, she crosses things out while she's reading aloud to a bookstore audience. And I would like to go into bookstores and cross things out in the books, but I'd be arrested probably. So I don't do it.
Well, I think that's why good advice for someone who's writing is read your work aloud. And
yes,
really,
definitely.
Really listen to it, because you will want to do that.
You'll hear the musicality. You'll hear all the bad words, not
the stuff you don't need.
Bad moments, the overwriting, the repetitions, the words that try to please too much, the little darlings you're supposed to kill.
Helma, I'm sorry, there just came something from our friend Galen Williams.
Oh, Galen. Oh,
Galen said, did you see that, Emily?
Yeah.
How do you manage to look like that at 91?
Oh, Galen, we have to get your cataracts taken care of.
Yeah, let's tell her about our pink light, Hilma, too. We have
Galen Williams is the founder of Poets and Writers. I think that's important to say.
Yes, and a wonderful friend.
Yes.
We love you, Galen.
Yes, indeed. And hello to Susan, too, who's a friend who asked a question before, Susan Isaacs.
And Meg is also on, so.
Okay.
Oh, well, she's sort of a friend.
Yeah.
We're friends on Facebook.
Okay. I guess just one more question.
Yes.
For both of you, Matthew de Guzman, sorry if I mispronounced that. What books are you each reading now? Is there anything you're just devouring, loving, reading a lot of?
Judy, do you want to take it first?
Well, Emily, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but it's a good thing, right? I'm around the corner from a new indie bookstore in New York, and I just bought 3 hardcover books. And I said, oh my God, we should be buying them from our own bookstore. And George said, no, this is a good thing to do. This is a good thing to go into another bookstore as a visitor and buy books. And I bought Sally Rooney's new book, which I have just started. And I bought The Magician by Colm Toibin. And I bought, it's 800 pages long, and it's sitting on my table. I haven't started it yet. Help me here, somebody.
Letters of William Du Bois?
Yes. Yes.
That's the longest one I could think of right now that you
Thank you, Emily. Yes, and I'm like, what am I doing here? But those are 3 new books that I want to read, and I've started with Sally Rooney.
Well, I'm not reading anything that recent. I was reading Jenny Diskey's essays. She is a writer who I just find marvelous. She's funny, she's sharp, she's serious, she's intelligent, she's just brilliant. She died in her 60s, and she has a wonderful memoir called Ingratitude that can be read as 1 word or 2, which is a very interesting title, one of the best titles next to mine. And she was taken in as a teenager, as a troubled teenager from a troubled household by Doris Lessing, who gave her a very mixed blessing of introducing her to literary society and literature, but also not being a very good maternal figure. So her essays are just absolutely wonderful. And then I'm also rereading Diana Attill's Somewhere Towards the End, which reinforced my feeling that you don't have to be old on the page. Nobody can see you typing in your pajamas. I mean, you don't have to have good legs. And when I think of Philip Larkin's poem, The Old Fools, and he lists all the things wrong with the old fools, how they're drooling, how they're limping, and how they can't see or hear and stuff. And he says, why aren't they screaming? And I think Diana Attill actually answers this because she's so invested in life. She has no time to scream. She's looking backwards, she's looking forward, she's enjoying the moment. She was 89 when she wrote that. And to me, it's a remarkable book.
Hilma, I just want to, before we leave everyone here, to say not only are your stories funny, but they're sexy. And they're sexy in this wonderful way that it's marital sex. It's marital sex and it's so good.
Marital sex is pretty sexy.
It's pretty sexy. You got to keep it going. It can be pretty sexy.
Yes.
Yeah. You and Morty were a pretty sexy couple.
Thank you. You and George sure are too.
Thank you.
We were a great foursome, especially when we were watching those Mets games.
Oh yeah,
Let's go Mets.
Let's go Mets. Yes, we used to do that. We watched them. We watched the Mets Yankee game the other night.
Yes, I watch every game. And
I know you do. I know you do.
I do say that, unlike my character, I don't talk to Morty. But every once in a while, when I'm watching a game, I still sleep on my own side of the bed. And if somebody gets a home run or somebody makes an error, I find myself turning and saying, "Did you see that?" And I say it out loud, and I catch myself.
What's wrong with that?
Well,
nothing's wrong with that, Hilma.
I guess not really.
No, nothing is wrong with that. This has been wonderful, Hilma.
Judy, thank you so much.
But it makes me yearn to be with you in person. When can we do that? We have to talk.
I know. I promise not to serve shrimp salad if you come here for lunch.
I got a third shot and George did too. So
well, that won't protect you against shellfish, just against COVID.
I hope so. Thank you, Emily, for being here for us as always.
Thanks. I love you, Judy.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. We've sent out the link to the book a couple of times, and you'll get emails as well with links to the book, to our website where you can purchase the book. And thank you all. Thank you, Hilma. Thank you, Judy. It was a wonderful event. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Emily.
It was special for me, Hilma. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you for coming.